So Farida is a sociologist and professor of anthropology and sociology at Curtin University. She has a research focus on migration, race and ethnicity, refugee settlement, racism, nationalism, global citizenship, and cosmopolitanism. She has published widely with over 130 journal articles, so a very impressive human being, chapters, books, and reports. And she joined Curtin in 2022 as part of the Global Futures Initiative. So Farida, I'd like to welcome you to speak with us now.
Thank you, Natando, and greetings from Naarm, from Melbourne, where I'm here and for a number of conferences, and just like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people here of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And the conferences that I'm here for, one of them is a Settlement Council of Australia conference, which was a really interesting opportunity to re-engage with people who work with the settlement of migrants, particularly those of refugee backgrounds. And I used to work very closely with some of these people on projects that were looking at the ways in which well, the sorts of challenges that a lot of people of humanitarian visa entry backgrounds have in settling in Australia. And that was partly one of the reasons that we have developed this project, which is an attempt to tell a slightly different story from the kind of deficit story that we often hear about Africans within Australia. So that was a really fun conference to be part of. But our goal in this particular research project is to look at the contributions and the economic and political agency that those of African backgrounds in Australia demonstrate as part of their settlement process. And we're interested in expanding the research focus on Africans in Australia from those of humanitarian backgrounds. 95% of the research that has been done has been focused on those with who've come under the humanitarian provisions, to the much wider communities. And this is specifically what Sarah will be talking about. So who are Africans within the Australian context? So sorry, could we flip back to the previous slide? I just wanted to make the point that sorry, yep, just the one with the photograph. So we had a workshop to start this Australian Research Council funded project back in July this year. And this is a photograph of the project team. I won't go through everybody's names, but you can see the affiliations on the side. And this is our wonderful team of 9 chief investigators, as well as Natando there, who's our wonderful coordinator, Mohammed, who is helping with the postdoc kind of role, and also Ruvi there, who is undertaking a PhD as part of this project. And Janet, whose picture is there as an insert, wasn't able to make that workshop, but we didn't want her to miss out. And you can see that a lot of I think everybody from our project team is actually joining us today as well, from all corners of this wonderful country that we live in. Okay, so next slide. I'm not going to go through the research objectives, but you can see some of the points that I've already made. The focus is on looking at political and economic contributions of the African diaspora living within Australia. And we're going to develop our understandings of the agency which is manifest in this community through a number of different sub-projects. And if I can just have the next slide. Again, I'm not going to go through in detail all of the different sub-projects that we are working on, but the one that Sarah will be talking about today is basically looking at that point A there in the first one, getting a baseline socio-demographic profile of the Africans who have settled in Australia. We will also be conducting a national survey, and we hope that our participants today will help to publicise this research and encourage people of African background to participate in that survey when it comes out. We are also undertaking some social media analysis, looking at the ways in which African community organisations represent themselves online, and we're also looking at political discourse, the ways in which our politicians and others talk about our relationship, Australia's relationship with Africa, and our relationship with the African communities within Australia. And then we're doing a number of qualitative interviews with African background community leaders, diplomats here, Australian political leaders, and also African community members. And we'll be starting those interviews within the next few weeks, having just received ethics approval to conduct the research. So that's a quick background to the large research project, and I'm very pleased today that we have Sarah, who has been working very, very hard with the existing data to give us a clearer sense of who this population is, because we have an idea of who Africans in Australia are, and I think it's quite a skewed vision. It's the vision that is perpetuated by the media, it's a vision that's perpetuated by our politicians often, but we haven't had the facts put together in this way yet. So it's really groundbreaking work that Sarah has been doing. So thank you all for joining us, and I will throw back to Ntando, who will introduce Sarah for us.
Thanks, Farida. It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Associate Professor Sarah Prout Quicke. So Sarah is a population geographer and Associate Professor in Geography in the School of Social Sciences at UWA. Her research interests lie at the intersection of sociology and demography and how these shape and are shaped by place. The early phase of her research career focused predominantly on the population mobilities of First Nations people in Australia and the implications of Indigenous mobility and migration for social policy. Having travelled regularly to the African continent over a period of subsequent years, Sarah has more recently begun to draw together her research interests and expertise in population geography with those deepening ties to African communities both in Africa and Australia. She's passionate about translating population insights for social policy and practice. And now over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Ntando, for that introduction, and I just want to add my thanks to all of you for joining us today in the midst of what is no doubt a busy end-of-year time. It's really wonderful to have so many online, and as Ntando said, we're launching today this working paper series that's part of one of the outcomes or outputs of this research project. And the idea behind the working paper series is really to kind of put out emerging research findings as they're coming through for the purposes of dialogue and building partnership with a whole range of different stakeholders. So it's wonderful to have you on the webinar today. I really look forward to your questions, and I also look forward to kind of feedback on the working paper and the findings of the research. So today there's three things that I want to cover in providing a bit of an overview of what the working paper does. I thought I'd speak briefly about some of the dynamics of African migration to Australia. Then talk briefly about some of the characteristics of African migrants that we can draw together from existing data sets. And then just to finish very briefly by talking about the geographies of African migrant settlement in Australia. As you're joining the webinar, if you could please pop your microphone on mute so that we don't have feedback, that would be really helpful for us. So what I'm presenting today is really just an introductory examination of some of the data based on analysis of census and administrative data. That is data that we already had access to before we really started kind of gathering more data as part of this project. And this is kind of a 50,000 foot view, if you like, of that data. We will be doing more detailed analysis as the project unfolds, but the objective here really at the beginning of the project was to identify some broad trends that we're then going to dig into further throughout the course of the project. And as Ntando said, everything that I'm presenting today, there's about a number of graphs and tables and maps, hopefully not too many, will be available for you to download in the report immediately after this. So it will be available on our website. We'll also send a copy around to everyone that's participating in today's webinar. So feel free just to take it in. Don't feel like if you're interested in it that you need to take photos or anything. All of that information will be available to you afterwards. I also don't have a huge amount of information about who is joining us today. So I know that there are some people that are absolute experts in this data that I'm going to be presenting, and there may be some that are not as familiar with the data. So please forgive me if I'm going over things that are very familiar to you in explaining how we've conducted the analysis or what the data are saying. I know that some of you have a really good grasp on this already. So I thought to start with, as we're talking about the migration dynamics of the African diaspora in Australia, and I should say there are lots of different ways that we can define the African diaspora, but in this particular report, we're really referring to first generation, that is African-born people living in Australia. And I thought it would be helpful, before we get into the Australian experience, to place Australia, I suppose, in the global context when it comes to African migrants. So the data in this map are estimates from the United Nations produced in 2020. And I've cross-checked these data with census data from a couple of countries, and they seem to be fairly accurate estimates. And so what we've done here is just show in map form where Africans living outside of their country of birth are located. And the first thing to note here is that there are about 40 million Africans living outside of their country of birth, and just over half of those are living within other countries on the African continent. If we look outside of the African continent to Africans living abroad, we find that France, the United States and Saudi Arabia host the largest African diasporas. There are a little over 4 million Africans living in France, and almost all of them, or many of them, are from just 3 countries, Algeria, Morocco and Tunisia. And in fact, that's a bit of a trend for the African population living outside of the African continent. So in Saudi Arabia, for example, most African migrants come from Egypt, and all of the rest of the African migrants come from Ethiopia or Sudan, so just 3 countries. The United States, there's a similar pattern of about 5 countries that kind of tend to really dominate that diaspora. Australia then hosts the 12th largest community of Africans outside of the African continent. And I make the point in the paper that it's clear from these data that African immigration pathways, as with most global immigration pathways, are deeply influenced by distinct historical, geopolitical and economic ties, as well as, of course, particular instruments of migration governance. So that's a bit of global context. If we then drill down and move from the global context to the Australian context and look at how the African diaspora here compares in size to other migrant communities. So this pie chart breaks the Australian population up by region of birth, drawing on 2021 census data and specifically resident estimated population or estimated resident population. And so we can see here that about 70% of the population living in Australia at 2021 were born in Australia. That figure is a little bit deceptive. I mean, they were born in Australia, but if we consider a large chunk of them are first generation migrants, so they have at least one parent that was born overseas. And so if we think about the kind of overseas born first and second generation migrants, 52.1% of people living in Australia were born overseas or had a parent that was. Those born in Africa make up about 1.9% of the total Australian population and 6.6% of the overseas born population. So a relatively small part of Australia's overall population profile, but a significant and growing part of the migrant population. That, of course, doesn't include second generation migrants, and looking at census data, we can see that there's about 326,000 second generation Africans. That is people that were not born in Africa but had at least one parent that was born in Africa. If we then look at where those African migrants living in Australia, first generation African migrants living in Australia, are coming from, we can see, and this is what this map is showing, it's the country of birth for African people living in Australia. And we can see that there are several countries that really dominate, a little bit like we see in the global African diaspora. So South Africans make up 40.7% of the African-born population in Australia. They are, of course, the largest group of African-born people living in Australia, followed by Egypt, Zimbabwe, Mauritius, and Kenya. And those top 5 countries of birth make up 70.5% of all African people born in Australia. So there's a sense in which these particular countries tend to really dominate the diaspora, though it's worth noting that there are African migrants from every country in Africa living in Australia. So it is a very diverse diaspora, even though it's dominated by those particular countries. And I think the final point to kind of make here is that clearly the drivers of migration from the African continent to Australia are not merely functions of origin country population or economy size. So if the pattern of migration to Australia was merely a function of the size of African countries, then we would see a much larger diaspora population from Nigeria in Australia. That is a really growing population in Australia, as we'll see in a moment, but it, at the moment, represents about 2.5% of the overall African first generation diaspora in Australia. There is certainly a sense in which some of the larger economies in Africa are dominating, so South Africa and Egypt are among those, but there are clearly other things going on here. Mauritius and Zimbabwe have really large populations in Australia. And so one of the things that this project is interested in doing is kind of understanding what some of those linkages are. We already know some of those things, but to press in and understand them more deeply is partly what we're interested in this project. So in keeping with this first theme of the dynamics of African migration to Australia, it's helpful then to take a long historical view of the migration corridor. And so here we're looking at data on the African-born population at each census in Australia since 1901. And I want to point out before we get into any analysis that the 3 categories of migrant communities used here are not some kind of analytical device that I've dreamed up. So please don't take from this that I think Egypt and South Africa are the only 2 countries that are worth kind of singling out in exploring this. It's just that these were the only 3 categories of disaggregation that are consistently used for country of birth reporting in Australia's historical migration statistics. So I'm using the data that we had available to us. And I think the first thing to note here, of course, is that there is this really long history of African migration to Australia. Many of us will be familiar with the kind of history of ties between South Africa and Australia. Those are colonial, they're military, they're economic connections, and those are well known. But of course, there is a long history that's less well known as well, a history of Black African migration to Australia. There was, of course, a number of African and African American convicts on the first fleet, and others that followed on subsequent ships. So pictured here, of course, is one of the better known early African American arrivals to Sydney, William Blue, who was transported from Sydney to London, from London to Sydney, where he'd worked as a chocolate maker, from understanding, and a shipyard labourer following the War of Independence. And he was brought to Sydney to serve out the remainder of his sentence, reportedly for stealing raw sugar. And he later became the harbour watchman, and you might know Blues Point in Sydney, which is named after him. So there's this kind of long history of much broader migration to Africa than simply from South Africa as well. The other thing to point out here, I think, there's lots of things that we could talk about, but just to draw out a couple key highlights, is the rapid growth in the African population living in Australia, particularly since the late 1990s. And we can see that the abolition of the White Australia policy was really important in broadening and increasing African migration to Australia after the 1970s. But it's after the 1990s that the growth really begins to take off. And this is in contrast to other migrant communities that I've also included here on that dotted line, whose numbers had grown much more linearly since sort of the mid-1940s. So this table drills down to the country level so that we can see which specific migration corridors have contributed most to that growth. It presents data for just the top 20 countries of birth, and I've listed these in order of size of the migrant population for the 2021 census. So column 1 shows the population counts in 2020 using estimated resident population counts. Column 2 is the 2021 counts. Obviously, then column 3 is the difference between those. And column 4 is looking at the proportion of people in 2021 at the 2021 census who arrived in Australia since the year 2000. It's drawing on a slightly different data set. And so what we see here really is that numerically the largest increases over that period were from South Africa, Zimbabwe and Kenya. And the late and preeminent population geographer Graham Hugo noted that there was from the 1970s something of an exodus of the white African populations in East and Southern Africa following the struggle for independence and decolonisation in those regions. And then another wave of South African and Zimbabwean migration in the mid-1990s, and that's kind of continued as a steady stream since then. There's also been an increase, if we look in that last column in particular, in refugee arrivals from certain countries that had limited or really no migration to Australia prior to the late 1990s. So Sudan and South Sudan feature strongly here, and if taken together, constitute the third largest increase numerically over that period. Although, as we'll see in a moment, this makes up a much smaller component of overall growth within the African diaspora. And it's just worth noting that the majority of African-born people in Australia in 2021 arrived since the early 2000s. About 66% have arrived since that time. So if we examine the 5 fastest growing national African communities in Australia, other than Sudan, we find real diversity in the migration pathways. So we talked briefly about predominantly what has driven migration from Sudan, but in this table we're looking specifically at the other 5 fastest growing countries over that period, or countries of birth over that period. And so this table is drawing on 2016 data rather than 2021 data because I wasn't able to access the 2021 data in time for the publication of this paper. We'll do that and have that analysis available earlier in the new year. But in some ways, the 2016 data could be potentially more revealing than the 2021 data, given that this latest census occurred right at the height of the pandemic. So that will have impacted the number of temporary visa holders in Australia. And so what we're looking at here in this table is that in 2016, the first row is looking at what was the estimated resident population, so what's the population count of people from those countries of birth in Australia. And then in the second row, we're looking at the number of people whose last visa was granted since the year 2000. So this is not actually the same as the year in which that person arrived. Some people will have arrived earlier and then had their more permanent visa granted since that period, but we're looking at people whose last visa has been granted since 2000. And then each of the subsequent rows is kind of a proportional breakdown of that second row figure, if that makes sense. And what we're looking at here is the kind of main migration pathways or the visa streams under which those people have immigrated since the year 2000. So a couple of things to point out here which are interesting. I think the first overarching thing to point out, perhaps before getting into any of these individual countries, is that hopefully what you can see here is that there's a real diversity of pathways through which different migrants are coming to Australia according to the country that they might be from. So most South Africans and Zimbabweans have, as you can see, arrived via a skills pathway, and to a lesser extent via family reunification pathways. Interestingly, the Nigerian and Kenyan-born populations are including a significant share of migrants on student visas. And so there was a significant growth in the number of Africans migrating to Australia on student visas since the 1970s, but that's really increased more significantly in recent years. And this is kind of a part of the story that I'd like to chase down a little bit more, in a little bit more detail as we continue on with this research project, is understanding kind of how changes in that form of migration pathway have unfolded for African migrants. But Nigerian and Kenyan-born students make up the first and third largest of all African-born students on tertiary student visas in Australia, with Mauritius being the second largest group, or those from Mauritius, I should say. The Ethiopian profile is dominated by humanitarian and family permanent visa streams, as you can see. And across these top 6 largest migrant groups, I think it's worth noting, and that's if we include the Sudanese and South Sudanese populations as well as rapidly growing populations. Humanitarian entrants made up 16.5% of those whose last visa had been issued since 2000. I think Farida made the point earlier that these are the communities around which most research and a lot of media coverage in Australia tends to be focused, but there is a much larger group within the African diaspora that has had less focus and attention that we're really interested in exploring in this project. And so just coming back to this slide, I think what we see is that most of the recent arrivals to Australia have not been refugees over that last 20 years. They've been skilled migrants and increasingly students. And most of this growth has been from South Africa and Zimbabwe. And so for social scientists, at least, one of the common questions that emerges at this point is, well, who are these South African and Zimbabwean migrants? And in particular, are they migrants who would be perceived by the broader Australian community, for example, as visibly white or black migrants? And one of the reasons we often want to understand this better, of course, is because while race is a social construct, racism is real, and racial discrimination. And so visible difference can significantly influence migrant integration experiences and, more broadly, the exercise of political and economic agency, which we're really interested in this project. And so one of the challenges that we face in answering questions like this in Australia is that we don't really collect data on a range of kind of formal types of racial identities like some other countries do. We, of course, have a question about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origins, but we don't have a more systematic way of collecting broader data about racial identities. And so in answering this question, the kind of best data that we have is around ethnic or ancestry, really. And in respondents answering the census form, they are asked a question about their ancestry, and they're asked in answering that question to consider the ethnic origins of their parents and their grandparents. Now, ethnicity, of course, is not the same as race, and trying to extrapolate race from questions around ethnicity is fraught. But what we've tried to do here, and I really want to credit in particular Farida, whom you've met, and also Karen Farquharson, who's from the University of Melbourne, 2 experts in this area on the research team who worked closely with me on this. We took the ABS's existing classification of ethnicities and sort of reclassified those into broad, what we're calling kind of ethno-racial groups. And then we sought to analyse the ancestry of the whole African-born population through that grid. I'm not going to go into a lot more detail about that process here, but Alongside the report that we're releasing today, we'll be publishing an appendix which goes into quite a lot of detail about that methodology if you're interested in it. And of course, we'd really welcome feedback and questions about that as well. So here's what we found when we undertook this analysis. We found that the single largest ethno-racial group in the African diaspora in Australia is European. So 31.4% of people from African-born people living in Australia in 2021 identified only European ancestry. That's through only identifying one ancestry or identifying two different ancestries that were both European. There was also a further around 10% who identified their ancestry as being a combination of European and something else. And in just over half of those cases, the something else was South African ancestry. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. The next largest group at 18.9% identified as only having sub-Saharan African ancestry. But it's worth noting here that we excluded from that category, sub-Saharan African, those people born in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Kenya, sorry, not people born, people who listed their ancestries as South African, Zimbabwean, Kenyan and Mauritian. And again, I won't go into a lot of detail about exactly why we did that in this analysis, but the point here is that if we include people who identify those countries, that percentage goes up significantly. One of the reasons why we didn't do that, of course, is because they are the largest kind of diaspora populations in Australia. The other is that most of those countries have really diverse ethnic and in some cases formalized kind of different racial groups. And so it's very difficult to determine kind of ethno-racial identity by looking at kind of that nationalized or national ancestry. So we can see then the next largest group were those who identified their ancestry as South African, and it was really difficult for us to be able to get any sense about what visible difference might look like from those who have South African ancestry, given that there are a whole range of different kind of ethno-racial groups within South Africa itself. And you can see the rest there, Egyptian and other North African. There was different kinds of ways in which people describe their ancestry. So we've tried our best to kind of group those into groups that kind of make sense. But I think one of the broader points here is that ethno-racial diversity among the African-born population is quite difficult to enumerate with any certainty. So it's quite possible that that the proportion of African-born people in Australia who have European ancestry is much higher. It's also possible that those who have sub-Saharan African ancestry are much higher, but it's difficult for us to be kind of certain about that in any greater detail than what we've been able to paint here. Other large groups of kind of ethno-racial diversity included the Egyptian-born population, as I mentioned, at 6.3%, and then also the South Asian population at 3.9%. So really considerable diversity within the African-born population living in Australia on that front. If we continue on with this second theme of the presentation on kind of African migrant characteristics, another really crucial dimension of difference and diversity to understand is age structure. And I say that not just because I'm biased as a population geographer, but because, as we'll see in a moment, understanding this context can be really crucial for interpreting data on things like labour force participation or sources of income and other measures that we're interested in this project. And so what I've done here is produce population profiles based on African region of birth for the African-born population living in Australia. So the map down the bottom there shows just the proportion of African-born people living in Australia from each of the African Union regions. And then you can see that I've mapped out the population structure for each of those regions. So we're aggregating up here from country of birth to broad region of birth. And a couple things to point out here, I suppose, some of which are quite self-evident, but what we see is that most of the African-born population in Australia is concentrated in the biologically productive and working ages, especially West and Central African-born migrants. And this, of course, is not really surprising. It's quite consistent with Australia's shifted immigration policy since 1996, which is really focused on young and working-aged skilled populations. And what we see in most cases here is that the African-born population in Australia reflects that. North African-born population is a clear exception here, and I think what we're seeing in this profile is evidence of two clear migration waves. So those concentrated in their 60s, 70s and 80s are very likely the children of those who formed part of a large first wave of migration from Egypt in the mid-1950s and early 1960s. And many of those individuals are reaching their retirement years or are in their retirement years now. And then those concentrated in their 30s and 40s are likely to represent the more recent uptick in immigration from Egypt in particular. And then the Southern African-born population pyramid is a really interesting contrast to that North African population. So given the long history of migration, particularly from South Africa to Australia, we might expect to see a lot more evidence of population aging among the South African-born population, or the Southern African-born population, I should say. But we don't really see that. And so this is suggestive, perhaps, of significant population churn, movement back and forth of South African migrants between Australia and South Africa, and perhaps especially among older South Africans. So it may be that when older South Africans reach retirement age, more of them are heading back to South Africa. I don't know, but it's just an interesting contrast here that you would expect to see much more population aging in that population if those migrants had continued to remain in Australia. So it's important to kind of keep this picture in mind as we look at just the final couple of slides. I've got like 3 more slides left and a couple more graphs, so I hope I haven't kind of done death by PowerPoint for you on the graphs front, but we're almost at the end and then we'll have time for questions. So what I wanted to just note here is some of the forms of socioeconomic difference that we also see among the African-born population. And so what I've done here is aggregated, again, the African-born population into region of birth. And I'm contrasting that, or comparing, I should say, that to all of the rest of the migrants living in Australia who are not African-born as a whole category, and then the Australian-born population as well. So you can see each of those categories reflected here. And what we're looking at here is highest level of qualification by regional place of birth in the 2021 census. And what's really interesting here is that even though African-born people are more highly educated, and we can clearly see that. So those from West, Southern and North Africa have a higher prevalence of tertiary level qualifications than all other overseas migrants in Australia and the Australian-born population. And we can also see that almost all African migrants have lower rates of low-level educational achievement, so grade 9 or below, for example, when compared to both other migrant communities and the Australian-born population. So the African diaspora in Australia is highly educated when we compare it to other migrants in Australia and the Australian-born population. What's really interesting, though, is that we find that with the exception of the Southern African-born population, they mostly have higher unemployment rates than other migrants and the Australian-born population. And in some cases, those rates are slightly higher. In some cases, they're significantly higher. And I'm not going to show those data here because I think we're probably at risk of graph overload, but they are in the report and you're welcome to have a look at that in more detail if you're interested in. And so that suggests that there is potentially some forms of discrimination, or at least particular challenges that African migrants are facing within the labour market. The last graph that I want to show before just briefly talking about the geographies of settlement in Australia is about the main source of income for African migrants in Australia. And again, I've listed these using the same categories as in the previous graph. And we start with dark blue with employee wages. We move on to kind of different forms of income, from investment, business ownership and superannuation, through to those whose primary source of income is some form of government benefit or allowance, and those who are not receiving any kind of income. And a couple of key points to, I think, draw out here. One is that the regions with the longest migration histories to Australia, so North Africa in particular with Egypt, and Southern Africa with South Africa in particular, also have the highest rates of business ownership and investment income. And this is something that we really want to explore in more detail. We're really interested in entrepreneurship in this project, African entrepreneurship, how that occurs, under what conditions, and there seems to be potentially some link here between the length of time that a diaspora has been established in Australia and the extent of that kind of business and investment income. And then the second thing I think to note here is that rates of dependence on government benefits and allowance are really sensitive to population age structure. So if we look at North Africa, for example, this is a highly educated diaspora. This is a diaspora that has high levels of labour force participation. So I suspect probably what's going on here is that we can see the impacts of population ageing that are occurring in the North African diaspora, with more people retired and potentially drawing a pension income here. Central Africa has a similar profile, but I would say potentially for different reasons, and so much more prevalence of potentially young families who might be drawing on other forms of family benefits and allowances. There could be Central African migrants also tend to have higher levels of unemployment, and so there are different reasons that are going to sit behind these different sources of income. And again, this is something that we're really interested to explore further as we progress with the project. Okay, the final slide of data to show you is about the geographies of African settlement in Australia. So we've talked about the dynamics of migration to Australia. We've talked about African migrant characteristics. We're also just interested in understanding, where are these different African migrants located in Australia? And so this final map shows the distribution of the African-born population in Australia at 2021. The large numbers represent the total African-born population, and then the smaller numbers compare those to the distribution of the total Australian population. And then I've also put in here little pie charts that show the top 10 countries of birth for the African diaspora living in each of those states and territories. And again, just a couple points to kind of draw out from this map, I think. And that is that, like the rest of the Australian population, almost half of the African-born population lives in New South Wales and Victoria. Where there's a significant point of difference is that the African-born population is disproportionately concentrated in Western Australia. So 20%, or just almost 21% of the African-born population live in Western Australia, but only 10% of the total national population. So there's a whole range of reasons why that might be, and again, many of us will understand some of those, and we'll explore some of them in more detail as this project unfolds. The other thing to note is that the composition of the African-born population in Queensland and Australia is quite different than in New South Wales and Victoria. So in Queensland and Western Australia, there's, as you can see, a real dominance of the South African and Zimbabwean-born population. In New South Wales and Victoria, the Egyptian-born population, which also dominates, is really significant. The Mauritian-born population and the Sudanese-born population are really significant in that top 10. So there are different migrant communities are moving to different parts of Australia for different reasons. And so understanding some of that diversity is partly what we're interested in this project as well. So let me just finish by drawing out, there's a lot of information that's been thrown at you, by drawing out just a couple key conclusions. I think the first is that the African migration to Australia has been rapidly increasing both in number and diversity, particularly since the late 1990s. So many people that are living in Australia today have arrived in sort of the last 20 odd years, and that's quite different from a number of other migrant communities in Australia. And it presents us with some really interesting opportunities to kind of chart how the experience of African migrants changes over time as that diaspora becomes more established in Australia. We've also seen that the drivers of that growth, as well as the outcomes for African migrants, can vary significantly by region and by country of birth. So there's a lot of diversity in terms of why people are moving to Australia, how they're moving to Australia, depending on those kind of geographical factors. Oops, got my last one here. In general terms, African migrants to Australia are young and highly qualified. And while many migrants from Africa to Australia are South Africans of European ancestry, there's also a considerable ethno-racial diversity within the African diaspora. So diversity is kind of the key word, I think, that emerges here. So I'm